Hello, and welcome to the Sleep Library. Wherever you are in the world, and whatever time it is as you press play, we're honored to keep you company as you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's story, take a moment to settle in. Feel the warmth of your blanket, the stillness around you, and the space you've made to simply let go. If you enjoy this experience, we invite you to subscribe to the Sleep Library. We create gentle, slow, and calming stories to help you sleep. Stories you won't hear anywhere else. And in the comments below, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Your words help us build a global, restful little community. One quiet listener at a time. Now, if you're ready, let's travel back to a time not often remembered, to a village where the wind listened and whispered back. It began with the kind of accident that no one notices at first. In the chaos of war, letters were both lifelines and liabilities, bundles of hope wrapped in frail paper, drifting across the smoke-blackened sky of 1916 Europe. Somewhere along the mud-caked trenches of the Western Front, amidst the howls of distant shell fire and the stench of damp wool and blood, Private Arthur Levinson scribbled the name Miss L onto the front of an envelope. The L was not an error, not quite. But it was incomplete. Arthur was not a great writer. His letters were awkward things, held together more by sentiment than by sentence structure. He came from a dockside town in East Sussex, the kind of place that smelled of salt and soot, where fathers didn't say "I love you," they just worked longer hours. He had never traveled far before the war, had never met someone who read poetry for pleasure or tied ribbons in her hair, and then he'd met Lily, or so he thought. He'd seen her only twice during leave in 1915. A friend of a friend's sister, she had been visiting her aunt in London. Her voice was soft but teasing. Her laugh not the giggle of flirtation, but the rich sound of someone unbothered by judgment. She had winked when he tripped over his words, and he had taken that wink like a benediction. They never exchanged last names. Still, that didn't stop Arthur from writing. In the flicker of candlelight inside a damp dugout, his hands wrapped in wool gloves with the fingers cut off, he addressed a letter with the sweeping confidence of a man who wanted something more than certainty. All he wrote on the envelope was, "Miss L, London," to the girl with the ribbon in her hair. If it finds her, it was meant to. And so it began. That letter bent, smudged, and nearly thrown away by a postal clerk, found its way into the home of Margaret Langley. She was not expecting it. She didn't know any soldiers. Her fiancé had died of scarlet fever 2 years before the war began. She had buried the ache and filled her days with quiet work as a seamstress in a small shop off Holloway Road. Her world was thread, fabric, and silence. Letters were things for other people, but this one arrived. She read it 3 times that first night. "Dear Miss L, I hope this isn't foolish. I hope you don't mind a stranger writing. You might be the wrong Miss L, or maybe you're the right one, and fate just doesn't need surnames anymore. I met you once, maybe. I remember a ribbon. I remember you laughed when I dropped my fork. You said something about the world needing more clumsy men. I've held on to that moment like a match in the dark. Maybe I'm lighting it again here. I'm writing this in a trench. There's a rat 2 feet from me who thinks I'm the guest. My boots haven't been dry in weeks, and the man next to me is snoring like a pub door creaking open. But I thought of you today, and that helped. If this reaches you and you're not her right back anyway, tell me I'm an idiot. Tell me about your street. Tell me what London sounds like now. Yours, even if wrongly. Arthur Margaret didn't know what to do with it at first. Her instincts told her to burn it, or at least to fold it back into the envelope and bury it in a drawer. But there was something honest in it, something absurdly brave. It had been years since someone had written to her simply because they wanted to connect. Everyone spoke in obligations now, in rations, in queues, in updates about gas masks and evacuations. But here was a letter that asked her to speak, to remember the sound of her own voice. So she did. She replied, "Dear Arthur, I'm afraid I'm not the girl with the ribbon, but I am someone who still laughs when forks fall. And I think the world needs more clumsy men, too." Your letter reached Holloway Road. No one here has winked at a soldier in years, but I'll borrow the memory and pretend it was me. London sounds tired. The sky keeps pretending not to be afraid, but the birds know better. They fly lower now. Tell me more about your rat. I think I'd like to name him. She signed it only, Miss L. That was how it began. A mistake wrapped in bravery, sent through fire and rain and fate. The letters kept coming. They became longer, warmer. Arthur told stories, some real, some exaggerated, some clearly designed to make her laugh. He described the shape of the moon from the trenches, the smell of his mother's old kitchen, the time a French goose chased a full battalion for stealing eggs. He was no poet, but he tried. Margaret, in turn, described the world he'd left behind. She sketched it with words. The bakery near the station where the owner whistled out of tune, the child across. The street who tried to teach pigeons to march the factory girls who still managed to flirt on lunch breaks. And slowly, like vines growing over a broken fence, their words reached across time and fear. They never addressed the war directly. Not at first. They wrote of cold mornings and noisy nights. They avoided names. Arthur never said, "I killed someone today." Margaret never wrote, "They bombed the hospital on the corner." But the spaces between their sentences held the truth like breath between sobs. And in those spaces they found something sacred. In November 1916, Arthur sent a small drawing, a terrible sketch of what was either a trench shovel or a duck. Margaret wrote back, saying it looked like a heroic parsnip, and Arthur claimed he'd name it Sir Parsnip, Knight of the Mucky Realm. That was the first time she laughed out loud in months. She didn't know what he looked like. He didn't know her full name, but they had invented a private world in ink and paper, stitched together across the fraying fabric of the war. And in that world there was no loss, no noise, no bleeding sky. Just two people who had found one another not despite the chaos, but through it. And somewhere in the dark, Arthur began to forget about the ribbon. The rain had stopped the day before, but the trenches still breathed with dampness. Everything felt heavy, the coats, the boots, the hearts. Soldiers squelched through the muck with habitual resignation, their minds elsewhere, on food, sleep, a memory from home. It was late October 1915 in the Somme, and James Whitmore, Private 3324, sat with his knees up and his journal balanced on them, his pencil clutched in a stiff, ink-stained glove. The front was quieter today, only the occasional distant thud to break the gray silence. That quietness, rare and almost sacred, opened a small, unexpected door. James had been writing letters for weeks, but not to anyone in particular. Some soldiers wrote to wives or sweethearts, but James had neither. So he began writing to a name he pulled from the pocket of a book he found in an abandoned farmhouse. An old copy of poems by Christina Rossetti, with a name scribbled in faded ink inside the cover. Margaret Hastings, 12 Whitfield Lane, Devonshire. He hadn't meant to write her at first. It was a whim, a strange reaching for something unconnected to war. The letter he sent wasn't even that personal. He wrote about the cold, the smell of stew made from tin, the sound of the trench at night. He described the view when he climbed the embankment, skeletal trees, mud turned silver by moonlight. He wrote it all plainly, without flourish, just words. And then, 2 weeks later, her reply came. James didn't believe it at first. He turned the envelope over in his hands, as if it might disappear. The handwriting was careful, slightly tilted to the right. The paper smelled faintly of lavender and dust, as if it had been kept inside a drawer with old linen. Inside, the words were gentle, unsure. Margaret Hastings wrote that she did not know who he was, but his letter had made her cry. She thanked him for writing, for the picture he had painted, for reminding her that even war carried moments of silence. It was the first letter James read aloud to his bunkmate, Thomas Elwood. Tom had a wife and 3 children back home, but even he stopped sharpening his knife to listen. "She sounds older," Tom said when James finished. "Writes like someone who's lived through hard seasons." James nodded. He hadn't thought about her age until then. It didn't matter. She had written back. In the days that followed, James found himself waiting for night, for rations, for words. He reread her letter in his dugout, traced the lines with his thumb. It was not love, not yet. It was something simpler. A voice in the void, so he wrote back, this time with more care. He described the smell of the morning gunpowder, the strange bird that nested just above their trench, the way the younger soldiers dreamt loudly in their sleep. He asked her about her home, her books, whether she had ever seen the sea in winter. Margaret replied again and again. Her letters unfolded like a forgotten novel, quiet scenes from her life in Devonshire, her late father's tobacco shop, her habit of walking along the cliffs at dawn. She told James about the cat that lived in the churchyard, the way the village bells sounded like they were ringing through fog. She told him she had lost a brother in Belgium the year before, and sometimes she walked without knowing where her feet were going. They never spoke of love, not directly. But each letter grew longer, and the spaces between them shorter. James began to notice things he wanted to tell her, the way a certain cloud looked like a violin, how the coffee tasted like burned paper. Everything became a story for Margaret. Then, one day, a photograph arrived. It was folded in a letter, slipped between 2 pages. A black and white image, faint at the edges, of a woman in a high-necked coat standing next to a horse. Her hair was pinned up, her gaze straight into the camera, not smiling but not stern. James stared at it for a long time. Tom whistled when he saw it. "She's handsome," he said. "You lucky bastard." James didn't know what he was. Lucky, maybe, or foolish. But in a war where everything was borrowed, time, food, hope, this felt like something he could keep. The war moved slowly. Days lost their names. Mud claimed everything. And still the letters moved. Through shellfire and snow, past checkpoints, and into postbags, through village stations and under the watch of tired clerks. They carried pieces of 2 people who had never met, yet imagined each other in the spaces where the world had once been whole. And then came the day that changed everything. A letter from Margaret arrived with new handwriting at the bottom. Her niece, Lillian. Margaret, it turned out, had passed away 3 weeks earlier. Illness, sudden and quiet. The letter had been finished by Lillian, who found a half-written page on her aunt's desk. She had wanted James to know. She had read some of the old letters, she said. They were beautiful. She promised to keep them safe. James sat alone when he read it. He did not cry, not then. Instead, he wrote one last letter. To Lillian. Lillian Hastings had not intended to open the letters. She had always known her aunt kept them tied together with a bit of old twine, stored carefully in a cigar box in the second drawer of the dresser by her bed. But it wasn't until the doctor came and went, and the house grew too quiet, that Lillian sat down on the creaking wooden floor and opened the drawer for anything that still carried warmth. What she found wasn't just a collection of pages. It was a dialogue, months long, between 2 people suspended between the dead and the living. One, a soldier in France. The other, her Aunt Margaret, who had always seemed a little apart from the rest of the village. Margaret, who wore her hair in simple braids until she was 40, who taught poetry to children without asking for pay, who never married, never spoke much of her brother who died in Belgium. Margaret, who smiled so softly it sometimes felt like an apology. Lillian had read the final letter aloud to herself before finishing it, and then, still holding the fountain pen, she turned the page over and added a few lines. Not because she knew the soldier, not because she expected anything, but because the silence felt wrong. She sealed the envelope, walked to the edge of the village, and slipped it into the narrow red postbox just before the evening train rattled by. She didn't think of it again until a reply came. James sat against the trench wall, paper in his hand, reading Lillian's note over and over. It was different from Margaret's, sharper, around the edges, younger, in rhythm, but something about it held the same kind of gentleness, a quiet that wasn't empty. She had finished the letter not with sympathy, but with steadiness. She had written, "I thought you should know. I hope this isn't a terrible kind of intrusion. I didn't know how to say goodbye to someone you hadn't met. I suppose this is my way of trying." There were no flowers pressed inside, no perfume or ribbon, just those words in black ink on a cream-colored page. He wrote back, slowly, "I suppose you have every right to ignore this letter, but your words felt like a lantern in a very long tunnel. Thank you, Lillian, and thank you for giving her letters a place to be read again." The war had grown darker. The Somme was turning into a furnace. But somehow, even in the roaring silence between bombardments, James waited for her reply. Not because she was Margaret, but because she had answered when silence might have been easier. And she did write back. Not a letter, at first. A postcard. A view of the Devon cliffs at dawn. On the back, in slanted writing, "The air is very cold here now. The gulls sound like screams when the fog is heavy, but the sea always comes back." That was all. James carried it in his pocket for weeks. Back in Devonshire, Lillian wasn't quite sure why she had written it. It wasn't grief exactly. It was something adjacent. Margaret S. death had left a shape in the house, an outline of a presence that Lillian kept bumping into. Her aunt's shawl still hung by the door. Her chair still held the bend of her body. And the letters, they were the only things that felt alive. So she sent the postcard. And when James replied again longer this time, with details about a thunderstorm that struck the camp and tore the field kitchen from its moorings, Lillian read it aloud, softly, in the stillness of Margaret's room. She wasn't falling in love. Not yet. She was falling into something else. The rhythm of correspondence. Over the months that followed, the 2 letters exchanged between James and Lillian became 4, then 8, then more than either of them had planned. They spoke little of Margaret. Instead, they talked about what remained. James sent Lillian the flattened stem of a wildflower he had found growing behind the latrine. "It smelled of nothing," he wrote, "but it grew here anyway, which feels like a miracle." Lillian sent James a drawing, just charcoal, on paper of the path she walked each day behind the church. It wasn't a good drawing. She admitted that, but she said, "I thought you might like to see something that isn't gray." She asked him what his middle name was. He said he didn't have one, but sometimes told people it was Rain, because he was born during a thunderstorm and had never learned to love dry weather. She asked about his mother. He said she died when he was 15. He still remembered the shape of her hands when she made bread. Lillian told James that she had once been engaged, briefly, to a boy who went to sea and never returned. They both laughed on paper about how they sounded older than they were. James was 27. Lillian was 25. But in the world they lived in, where time came in rusted metal and smoke, they both felt 70. And then came the day when a letter from James didn't arrive. Lillian waited 3 weeks, then 4. She wrote again, uncertain. There was no reply. She wrote a second time, just a line. Please let me know you're there. No reply. She imagined the worst. Then imagined something even worse than that. And just when she resolved to stop hoping, a letter came. It was shaky, hurried. The ink smudged, the paper slightly torn. James had been wounded in an artillery blast that collapsed part of their trench. He had been buried for 3 hours, his right leg broken, shrapnel in his shoulder. He was writing from a hospital bed near Arras, and the only thing he asked in the entire letter was this: please don't stop writing. Please. Lillian cried when she read it, not because of the injury, though that twisted something sharp in her chest, but because she realized she had been waiting not just for his words, but for him. He had become part of her mornings. The ink stains on her fingers. The reason she walked to the postbox in the cold with bare hands. So she wrote back every day. Small things, her cat's new habit of sleeping in Margaret's old chair, the recipe she had tried and burned, the 2 children who kept stealing apples from her garden. Every letter folded with care, each envelope sealed as if it were a promise. James replied when he could, his handwriting more slanted now, the rhythm slower, but the same voice. And then, without warning, a photograph arrived, a small one, black and white. James in uniform, seated in a wooden chair, leg in a brace, his face thin, but smiling almost. On the back, an uneven scrawl, so you know who's writing. I'll try not to look this serious if we ever meet. Lillian pressed it between the pages of poems by Christina Rossetti, right where her aunt's name had once been scribbled. Weeks passed, then months. James was transferred home, not to Devonshire, nowhere near it, but to a convalescent hospital in Surrey. He wrote to say he hated the sound of silence there. It was too quiet. No one knew how to laugh properly. The nurses were kind, but always busy. Lillian sent him clippings from newspapers, doodles in the margins, a pressed leaf, a joke about a cow and a parson that made no sense, but which he read 3 times anyway, just to imagine her laughing. One day she wrote, "If you ever come to Devonshire, I'll show you where the sea hides its secrets, and the cliff where the wind sings in Latin." He replied, "If I ever come to Devonshire, I hope it's to stay." Spring came. The war didn't end. But something else began. A space between words where love had started to grow. They hadn't said it yet. Not directly. But in the absence of saying it, they had written it 100 times. And neither of them wanted it to stop. The trenches had changed, not in shape or in sound, but in how they sat inside James Whitmore's chest. Since the letter from Lillian, he moved slower, spoke less, wrote nothing for 3 days. Even the birds, the ones that perched high in the broken trees above the trench, seemed to notice. They didn't sing, or maybe James just didn't hear them. But the silence broke on the 4th morning. A new letter. Different handwriting, yes. Lighter, a little looser. But it was addressed to him, carefully, purposefully. And it began simply, "You don't know me, but I feel like I know you. My name is Lillian." She wrote that she hadn't meant to read all the letters. But after Margaret passed, She found them in a tied bundle under her aunt's sewing basket. She read one, then another, then all of them. She said they were like a breath held between two strangers, a quiet kind of intimacy. Lillian confessed she had written the final letter to James with trembling hands, not out of fear, but because she didn't want to break whatever fragile thread had existed between them. But after days of thinking, she decided to write again, this time for herself. She told him she lived in the same cottage as her aunt had, that she had once been a school teacher, but now spent her days helping her father run the estate gardens. She had a dog named Pepper. She liked thunderstorms and peeling apples and reading by the fire. The letter rambled. It wasn't elegant, but it was real. James read it 3 times that night. He didn't write back immediately. He waited. He wanted the right words, and he wanted to be sure that writing Lillian wasn't a betrayal of Margaret. But as days passed, he found himself noticing things again. The exact shade of rust on the barbed wire, the little mushrooms growing near the trench wall, the way steam curled up from the coffee tin. So he wrote, slowly, carefully. He told her about a boy named Arthur who had once slept through a bombardment, about the way winter air stung the lungs at 4 a.m., about how some mornings he could swear the sky was still capable of kindness. She replied in kind. The rhythm began again. Letters once more flowed through the chaos. Lillian wrote about her garden, how the roses had overgrown their trellises, how she couldn't bring herself to trim them back. She told James about her childhood, about the one time she tried to run away at age 8 with only a biscuit and a picture book. Her words were different from Margaret's, more alive, less filtered through sorrow. But there was depth, too, a steadiness. James felt himself returning to something. Not the person he was before the war, that version was gone, but someone adjacent to him, someone not entirely hollow. Tom noticed. "You've got a ghost on your face," he said one night. "What?" "You look haunted, but in a good way." James didn't know what that meant, but he smiled. The weeks that followed became a strange kind of ritual. James would wait for the mail, pretending not to, as if he weren't looking for her handwriting. When the letters came, he read them slowly, deliberately, saving the last paragraph for nightfall, as if her words carried more warmth in the dark. She always signed her name the same way, yours, in thought, Lillian. There was something achingly careful in her voice, like she was afraid of stepping too far into something unnamed. But there was affection, too, hidden in the margins, between the descriptions of stubborn hedgehogs who nested under her porch and the poems she copied from the backs of seed catalogs. There was always a phrase or a moment that touched James in a way he couldn't explain. Not even to himself. He noticed it first in his hands. They had stopped trembling when he cleaned his rifle. When he wrote back, the words came with less resistance. He found himself describing things more vividly. The boots of the German prisoners who passed through their camp. The sound of snow sliding off a tarp in the middle of the night. The way Tom's snore changed pitch depending on the weather. But he didn't write only about war. That felt like a betrayal of the sanctuary they'd made of their letters. Instead, he told her about things he remembered, his mother's raspberry jam, the time he accidentally knocked over a wedding cake as a boy and blamed it on the dog, how his brother used to draw maps of places that didn't exist and name the mountains after sweets. In return, Lillian gave him pieces of a life that felt almost mythic. Her voice carried the weight of quiet afternoons, and kitchen smells and garden gates left swinging. She wrote about her father's cough and the way she played Chopin poorly but passionately on a warped piano. She mentioned a friend named Eleanor, a widow who made her own butter, and insisted that Lillian was foolish for writing to a soldier. But she kept writing, and James kept answering. In late February, the trench was flooded. It wasn't unusual, but it was brutal. Boots soaked, feet rotting, tempers fraying. The cold was different in wetness. It wasn't sharp. It was slow and creeping, like ivy growing up the spine. James tried to keep Lillian out of it. He didn't want her letters sullied by descriptions of trench rot and lice. But one night, with his skin pruned and raw, he wrote, "I think the cold has teeth. Not sharp, but patient. I'm afraid one day it will finish chewing through me." Her reply came back a week later. "If it does, I will knit you a new self from scratch. One with thicker skin and less worry behind the eyes, and more freckles. I imagine you with freckles." James laughed when he read it, a wet, startled sound that made Tom turn. "What's so funny?" "Nothing," James said. But he folded the letter and tucked it inside the inner lining of his jacket, close to the heart. One day a parcel arrived, not from home, not from command, from her. Inside was a pair of gloves, knitted, one thumb longer than the other, and a note. "They're terrible, but warm, like me. I wanted you to have something that wasn't made of mud or silence." James wore them until the fingers unraveled. He began dreaming again. Not always good dreams. Sometimes it was fire, screams, walls of dirt collapsing. But sometimes it was her, a garden gate swinging open, the smell of apples, a piano playing with 3 fingers too few. He started drawing, sketches in the margins of the letters, a leaf, a bird. Once he drew what he imagined her smile might look like. He never labeled it, but when Lillian replied, she wrote, "I looked at your sketch for a long time. I'm not sure what it is, but it made me feel seen." Then came March, and with it a letter that didn't arrive. James waited. He blamed the mail, the frost, the chaos of resupply. But after 2 weeks, he felt something else begin to settle in. That familiar hollowness, the same kind that came when Margaret's handwriting stopped. He didn't tell Tom. He just folded inward again, writing less, not sleeping, not eating much. But on the 10th day, the envelope came. Different paper, rushed script. Forgive the delay. Pepper knocked over the ink pot, and it took 3 days for the shop to open again. I hope you didn't think I forgot. I never do. James let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. By April, something had changed. Not in the letters, but in James. He had started imagining things, not hallucinations, not delusions, just possibilities. He imagined what her voice might sound like, thought about what she looked like reading his letters. Did she mouth the words? Did she cry at any point? He pictured her beside a window, hair half-pinned, firelight reflecting off the glass. He didn't want to admit it, but he was falling, not in the cinematic way. There were no violins, just a slow erosion of caution, a gentle surrender. Tom said one night, over a tin of something that resembled stew, "You write her every other day. You ever think what happens after?" James didn't answer, because he had, but the world was still full of barbed wire and snipers and deafening silence. It felt cruel to plan a future with ink and hope, but he did it anyway. He imagined seeing her at the train station. How strange it would be to match a face to the handwriting. Would she be taller than he thought? Would she recognize him instantly? Or would they need a moment of awkward silence before the world clicked back into place? He thought of these things more than he thought about death, and that in itself felt like a small revolution. It began with a feather, just at a small gray tuft, caught in the barbed wire outside James's dugout. It swayed in the wind, weightless against the mud-soaked world around it. He stared at it for nearly 5 minutes before plucking it free and tucking it into the corner of his notebook. When he wrote to Lillian that evening, he said only this: "Today, a feather survived what men could not." Her reply came faster than usual. That feather must have been very brave, or very foolish. "Which are you today?" He stared at her words until the candle burned low, thinking, not for the first time, how someone he'd never touched could disarm him so completely. May was a strange month. The birds returned. Not many, but enough to remind the men that the world hadn't ended. A few even nested in the beams above their station. Tom named one Albert. James thought it looked more like a Mabel, but said nothing. It felt good to disagree silently about something so small. In the letters, James began to include more observations, mundane things. "There's a private here who always sings to his bread before eating it. I watched a cloud today that looked like a crooked crown. It stayed too long and made me nervous. Tom thinks the rats have developed a union." Lillian answered each detail like they were part of a shared language. "The bread singer must be a romantic. Crooked crowns are often worn by the wisest fools. Tell the rats I said hello, and that I, too, support fair wages." Their correspondence had become something more than escape. It was a living thing, a creature of warmth and wit that bloomed in a world designed to extinguish such things. In late May, he found a wild violet growing beside a rusted helmet. It felt like a trick, a hallucination, but it was real. He pressed it between 2 pages of his notebook, careful not to bruise the petals. "It reminded me of you," he wrote. Not because it was pretty, though it was, but because it grew where it shouldn't have. Lillian's response came with a drawing, a clumsy sketch of a teacup holding a flower, labeled in careful block letters. Not all pretty things belong to the garden. He folded the drawing and kept it in his breast pocket, right next to the gloves. It wasn't all poetry. The war intruded. One night in June, they lost a man named Fairbanks. He had a daughter 3 years old. Used to show her picture like a magic charm against bullets. It didn't work. James didn't write to Lillian for 5 days. When he did, the letter was short. We lost someone. I can't say more. Just ... Remind me how to be human. Her reply was longer than usual. A list, the smell of fresh bread, the sound of your name said by someone who means it, the creak of a chair in an empty room, wind and curtains, the first bite of something too hot, being known, forgiveness, bad jokes told well. Pick any 2 and carry them with you, she wrote. They'll get lighter the more you walk with them. By midsummer, even Tom noticed the shift. You talk about her like she's real, he said one night. She is real, James answered. No, I mean not just real like alive. Real like here. Like you expect her to walk through the trench one day and ask for her gloves back. James smiled. Maybe she will. He wasn't being naive, not exactly. He understood the impossibility of it, the millions of things that would have to go right. But he'd stopped measuring his days by the number of shells or dead men. He counted instead by letters. Letter 38 had a poem in it. Something Lillian said she found on a church bulletin. I looked for God and found a child. Drewin soons and had dear would hair fingers. I asked her what she was doing. Suicide. Lighting the way for Worms. James didn't know what it meant, but he liked it. In July, James was given 3 days' leave behind the lines. Not home, never home, but a quiet farmhouse, commandeered and turned into a rest station. There was tea, real tea, and bread that didn't taste like sand. And there was silence, the kind that wasn't dangerous. Just quiet. He brought her letters with him, all of them. Sat in the attic beneath a beam that smelled of smoke, and read them out loud, everyone, even the jokes that didn't land, even the parts about Eleanor's butter, or the neighbor-esque goose that thought it was a cat. When he got to the letter where she described her mother's mirror, a cracked thing with silver flaking off the back, he paused. She'd written, I used to stare into it as a girl, pretending it showed a future instead of a face. I always saw something there, not a person, a feeling, like something was waiting, something with boots and dust and gentle hands. James didn't cry, but something inside him did. He replied with a story he hadn't told anyone. About the night before his deployment, how his brother tried to teach him to waltz in the barn, badly. How their mother watched, pretending not to. How the moonlight made everything look like it was already fading. I remember thinking then, he wrote, that I was already a ghost, that I had to make peace with not returning. But now, I think there's something waiting, something with ink on her fingers and a piano that's always a bit off-key. August came with a kind of heat that made metal scream. Letters were harder to send, harder to receive. Still, they managed shorter notes, quicker lines. Drank water from a helmet today. Tasted like iron and hope. Found a beetle with wings like stained glass. Let it go. Missed you more than I missed bread. And I really miss bread. Each note was a heartbeat, proof of life. Then, in early September, Lillian sent something else. A photograph. It wasn't what he expected. Not a portrait. Not posed. Just her hand, resting on a windowsill, holding a teacup, light slanting through the glass behind her. Her fingers ink-stained. On the back, I thought maybe you'd like to see the part of me that holds the pen. James stared at it for hours. Not because it was romantic, but because it was real, tangible. He touched the photo like it might hum. That night he dreamed of her voice. Not words, just tone. Low, amused, slightly tired. Like someone who had laughed too hard at something small and was still recovering. Later that week, he found himself sketching again. Not birds or leaves this time. Just hands, dozens of them, holding things, reaching, writing. One of them looked like hers. He sent the drawing, not expecting much. Her reply? I showed your drawing to Eleanor. She said you have the hands of a man who remembers. I think that's the highest compliment she's ever given anyone. Near the end of September, they were moved again, closer to the front, the kind of place where silence was suspicious, where footsteps meant death. James didn't write for nearly 10 days. Then, miraculously, they had a lull. He wrote under a tarp in the rain, cramped and shivering. I thought I lost the part of me that could miss things. But today I missed you like lungs miss air, like earth misses light, like the dead miss their names. When her response came, it was just one sentence. I miss you like skin misses warmth, like books miss breath, like letters miss hands. James read it until the paper went soft at the folds. Then he rewrote it in his notebook. Then again, like a prayer. June arrived with a heavy quiet. Not peace, never that, but a strange stillness before some unnamed storm. The men in James's company spoke in lower tones, drank slower, wrote faster. They all felt it. Something was coming. The letters, however, didn't stop. Lillian had taken to including tiny things with her notes, pressed petals, folded poems, once even a scrap of ribbon that smelled faintly of lavender. James kept them all in a small tin, tucked behind a loose board in his bunk. One night a storm rolled in, not war, just weather. Thunder so loud it seemed to crack the seams of the world. James sat upright, heart pounding, thinking it was an attack. But it wasn't. It was only sky. He stayed up, writing. The thunder reminded me of how small we are, but also how loud the sky can be when it remembers we exist. I don't know what that means exactly, just that I thought of you the entire time. In return, she sent a quote from a book he hadn't read. Some silences are so full they drown the noise. I think we share that kind of silence. He pinned it above his bunk. Then came orders. They were moving. A new sector, closer to the front. No one said the word, but everyone knew it was suicide. James packed lightly. A tin of letters, a photo of his mother, Lillian's ribbon, worn soft from handling. He didn't say goodbye to Tom. They just nodded, exchanged looks that held too much. On the truck to the new post, James did something reckless. He began a new letter. Lillian, if you're reading this, I've made it through. I want to believe that. I need to believe that. But just in case, this is the last ink I ever spill. Know this. I was never more myself than when I wrote to you. You are the best mistake I ever made. He folded it, sealed it, slipped it into his breast pocket. That night, they reached the new trench line. It wasn't a trench at all, just a dent in the earth, wet and skeletal, surrounded by the smell of copper and cordite. And waiting, 3 days passed. Rain came again, but not the kind that rinses, just the kind that soaks and stains. James found himself watching a bird, a sparrow, maybe darting between shell holes, searching for food or a miracle. He wondered if Lillian liked birds. She'd never mentioned them. So he wrote, "There's a bird here, bold as anything, stealing crumbs from boots. I think it thinks we're giants made of stone. Or maybe it's just trying to survive, like the rest of us. If I make it home, will you feed the birds with me?" He never sent that letter. On the 4th day, the call came, advance at dawn. The night before, James sat with his kit, rereading every letter she'd sent. He traced her words like they were a map home. He whispered parts aloud, just to hear her voice in his mind again, and then he began a new sketch. This time it was her. Not imagined, but felt. A face half formed by memory and invention, eyes that knew him, hands cupping light. He didn't finish it, just left it on his bunk beside the tin. He tucked her ribbon into his helmet and marched toward the morning. The offensive was brutal. Smoke so thick it painted the lungs, screams muffled by mud. Men fell like dominoes, not even knowing what hit them. James kept moving. He thought of her voice, of blackberry jam, of freckles he'd never counted. And just as the sky split open with machine gun fire, he dove not forward, but sideways into a shell crater, heart pounding, breath ragged. He stayed there, long enough to know he wasn't dead, long enough to whisper, "Thank you," into the dirt. Then darkness. He woke up 2 days later, wrapped in bandages, in a field hospital. The first thing he asked was, did they get the letters? The nurse didn't know what he meant. But later, when the chaplain came by, James begged him, "There's a tin. By my bunk, please. Just make sure she gets it." The chaplain nodded. And for the first time in weeks, James slept without dreaming of war, only of trains, and lavender, and a girl laughing over blackberry jam. The summer days stretched longer, hotter, quieter, and in war, silence is never peace. It's the sound before thunder, before the sky splits open and the world changes in a second. For James, time had turned strange. There were moments of absolute stillness when a bird would land on the trench edge and chirp like it didn't know this was hell. And there were moments of such chaos that even breath forgot to come. But through it all, he kept writing. To Lillian. To the idea of Lillian. to the version of himself that only existed in her letters. And she kept writing too, her ink always different, sometimes violet, sometimes green. Her paper sometimes perfumed, sometimes plain, but her voice never changed, warm, sharp, real. She had a way of making the war feel smaller than it was, until the day it wasn't. It began with a rumor. That was always how the worst days started. Some said there was a new offensive coming, a surprise push that would cost thousands of lives to gain inches of dirt. Others whispered about a mutiny brewing in a French regiment, that soldiers were cracking after too many senseless charges. But most just stared into their tin mugs and said nothing. The quiet ones were the ones to watch. James heard the whispers, but he had learned to tune them out like static on a radio. He had something to look forward to. A new letter was expected any day now. He felt it, like a sixth sense. He knew her rhythms by now. Every 6 to 8 days, without fail, she wrote him about her garden, about the stubborn peonies that bloomed late, about a boy in the village who tried to ride a goat and broke his ankle. She even sent him a dried lilac once, pressed in wax paper, though the scent didn't survive the journey. He carried it anyway. It lived in a tin with a bit of cloth, beside his rations, beside his heart. But that week, the mail didn't come. 2 more days passed, and then it happened. At dawn, the sky cracked. The enemy launched what would later be called the Red Morning, an hour-long barrage that turned the horizon to fire. James and his unit were caught in the midst of rotation, some coming back from the front, others just arriving. The lines were confused. The orders unclear, but the shells were not confused. One hit just behind the trench wall, lifting 2 men into the air like ragdolls. Another landed close enough to rupture James's eardrum. For 2 days afterward, the world sounded like it was underwater. By the time the smoke cleared, 15 men from his battalion were dead. And the letters? The crate had been hit, shredded, scattered, burned. When he found the pieces, they were barely paper. Ash soft, blackened at the edges, still warm. He recognized the green ink on one piece. He found his name on another. He dropped to his knees, hands shaking. This was worse than a wound. This was erasure. One of the younger soldiers, barely 18, walked past and muttered, "It's just letters, mate." James turned, slow, eyes hard. "She's not just letters." The boy looked confused, then afraid. Then he walked away. James stayed there, crouched in the dirt, picking up ash. Not crying, just dot, dot. Trying to breathe. That night he wrote anyway, even though he didn't know if she'd ever write back again, even though he didn't know if his letter would ever leave this place. "Dearest Lillian," he began, "today I watched fire fall from the sky. I watched men burn and others disappear under mud. I watched the sky turn red like something biblical. And yet, all I could think was, I hope you don't stop writing me. Your last letter didn't make it. I found pieces of it in the wreckage, like bones after a storm. I held one in my hand until it crumbled. But it's okay. because I still hear your voice. Is that strange? I hear you when the wind blows through the wires. I hear you in the silence after shell fire. I hear you in the quiet between my own thoughts. If you don't write again, I'll understand. But I'll keep writing you anyway, because hope, as it turns out, is not a choice. It's a reflex. Yours, even in ash, James. He folded the letter carefully, wrapped it in cloth, tied it with twine. He gave it to the mail officer, who said the route was unreliable now, but he'd try. James nodded. Try's all I can ask. The officer looked down. Then, almost shyly, said, She the one who writes with lilac paper? James nodded again. I hope she writes you back. So do I. 3 weeks passed. No letter. James kept busy. He helped dig new trenches, organize supplies, translate field orders for a French liaison. He even taught one of the new boys how to play poker using pebbles. He did not talk about the missing letters. Not once. But on the 22nd day, a miracle. The mail officer appeared, breathless, clutching a thin stack of letters. Sorting was a mess, he explained. Some got rerouted. Some turned up days late. But I think this one's for you. And there it was. Green ink, delicate handwriting. Her initials on the back flap. He held it like something sacred. Didn't open it for an hour. Just stared at it. Slept with it beside him. And when he finally opened it, in the half-light of morning, the first line hit him like breath, returning to drowning lungs. James, they told me the letters were lost, that there was an explosion. I thought it meant you. I didn't sleep for 2 days. I walked the garden like a ghost. My mother said I looked like I was mourning. I was, but then the postman came, with one scrap of your letter salvaged from the blast. Just one line. Hope is not a choice, that's all. Just that. And it was enough. So here I am, still writing, still stubbornly yours. P.S. I'm sending another lilac, pressed in a better way. I hope this one makes it. It did. It smelled faintly like spring, and James didn't cry. Not quite. But something in him softened, like steel losing its edge in the warmth. In war, nothing is guaranteed. Not tomorrow. Not a full night's sleep. Not a letter. But on that day, the letters did not end. They began again. And sometimes that's all hope is, the choice to keep beginning. Even when the world tries to make you stop. August came with a stillness that unnerved the trenches. Even the rats seemed to sense something looming. The sky stayed low, heavy with the kind of gray that didn't shift for days. And James, in the lulls between duties, found himself rereading Lillian's letters until the pages grew soft at the folds. There was one he always came back to. If this world ends before we meet, promise me you'll find me in the next one. I'll be the woman feeding birds on a bench near a quiet river. I'll wait, no matter how long it takes. He folded that line into the lining of his coat, a tiny prayer sewn into wool. The next offensive came without warning. They were ordered to move at dawn. No one slept. Even Tom, now healed enough to limp beside him, grew silent. James wrote a letter that night by candle nub. If you don't hear from me again, know that you were the best part of my life. Not a dream, not a distraction, but a reason. And if by some miracle I come back, I'll find you by that river. He tucked it in an envelope and gave it to Tom. If I don't make it, you know what to do. Tom only nodded. Then came the whistle, then the mud, then the madness. James ran with the others over broken earth, through smoke and wire. He didn't feel the bullet, not at first. Just a cold surprise, like falling into a river. He collapsed near a crater, mud rising up to greet him. Someone shouted. Someone dragged him, his ears rang, the sky spun. Then nothing. He woke up 3 days later in a field hospital. His leg was bandaged. The nurse said he'd live. Maybe limp, but live. He asked for his coat. Searched for her letter. Still there. Still folded. Still a reason. Weeks passed. Recovery was slow. Pain was ordinary now, a companion. But letters from Lillian came like morphine. Stories of her garden, her silly neighbor who painted all his chickens blue, her attempts at baking, and always, always that soft thread of waiting. I dreamt last night that you came home. You stood on the platform looking for me, but I was already running. I recognized you by your stillness. You held a cane and a daisy, and you smiled like someone who just remembered the word for joy. He held on to that line the way a drowning man might hold driftwood. In late September, he was given leave. Not much, a few days. Enough to rest or go home. He didn't hesitate. He wrote her, I'm coming. I don't know what platform. I don't know what time. But I'll be the man with a limp and a pocket full of your words. Wait by the river if you can, and bring the birds. When the train pulled into the station, James gripped the handle of his cane like it was a compass. The crowd blurred. People ran, people cried, people waved. Then he saw her, or rather he saw the daisy first, then the hands, then the eyes that had read all his grief and still stayed. Lillian didn't run. She walked, let him close the distance. And when he did, she reached out and touched his face like she was finishing a painting she'd been imagining for years. Neither spoke, not right away. There were no words big enough, just the sound of a train leaving, and the world beginning again. The cottage at the edge of Lillian's village was a quiet, ivy-covered thing that looked like it had been pulled out of a storybook and forgotten by time. It stood with its back to a thicket of trees, and its face turned towards an open field that used to be wheat, now mostly wildflowers. It was the kind of place where silence didn't feel empty. James had to duck to enter the doorway. His limp was heavier than he had expected, the injury deeper than any bandage could heal. But when Lillian caught his hand and led him inside, something eased, something about the scent of lavender and old books, something about the tea already steeping. For the first few days they didn't talk much about the war, not because it wasn't there. It always was, in the way James flinched at loud knocks, in the way Lillian avoided listening to the radio for casualty reports. In the silence between their words, the ones they couldn't yet say. Instead, they built a rhythm. Mornings were slow. She would make toast and eggs, and James would sit by the window watching the mist roll off the hills. Afternoons were for the garden. The soil was stubborn, but James liked its honesty. Nothing hidden, nothing exploding, just roots and growth and weather. He planted things, herbs mostly, mint, basil, a stubborn patch of thyme. Lillian teased him for talking to the plants, but he swore they listened better than most officers he'd known. At night they would sit by the fire. Sometimes she read aloud from old novels. Sometimes he wrote in a small notebook, words that he never shared. Sometimes they just sat, the kind of sitting that heals. One day a letter came. James recognized the handwriting immediately. Tom. The letter was brief. Back to the front. They need us for one more push. I'm fine. Don't worry. You did the right thing. Stay. Heal. She's good for you. I'll write when I can. James folded it and stared at the fireplace. You miss it? Lillian asked softly. He nodded. Not the war. The men, the way we held each other up, even in the mud. She sat beside him and rested her head on his shoulder. You held each other up? Let someone hold you now. The next morning, James didn't go to the garden. He went to the river, the same one they had written about. The bench was there. A woman was feeding birds. It wasn't Lillian, not yet. Just an old woman with crumbs and kindness. But the image stuck, like a prophecy still waiting to happen. When he returned, Lillian was in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled, her hair a soft mess. She was making soup and humming something tuneless. He kissed her cheek. For the first time since the war, he meant it without fear. That evening they opened a box of her childhood things. Letters from her school days, photographs, ribbons. Do you ever wish you could go back? He asked. She thought. Sometimes. But only if I could take the good parts of now with me. Like what? Like you, and the quiet, and the time in the garden that somehow doesn't die. He laughed, a real one, the kind that came from his stomach and startled the fire. One night, rain hammered the roof. James woke sweating, chest heaving, dreams thick with smoke and shouting. Lillian found him on the floor, eyes wild. She didn't ask. She just sat beside him, took his hand, and whispered a lullaby she barely remembered from childhood. Her voice trembled, but didn't stop. He fell asleep that way, with her song in his ear. By October, the garden was full. Not neat, not orderly, but full. Carrots poked through crooked rows. Beans climbed the trellis like wayward children. A sunflower bloomed defiantly next to a boot he'd forgotten in the soil. James stood in the middle of it one afternoon, muddy hands on his hips, and said aloud, I'm still here. Lillian heard him from the porch and smiled. Yes, you are. And it was enough. That winter, they rarely left the cottage. Snow turned the fields to hush. They played cards. They argued over the best way to make tea. They repaired an old radio that only picked up one station. Sometimes, when the wind wasn't too cruel, They walked to the river, sat on the bench, watched the birds. He held her hand. She leaned on his arm. No words, just the sound of living. And in the silence, the kind of love that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. October unfurled slowly, like the final pages of a letter written with care. The war had not ended, not officially, but for James and Lillian something monumental had shifted. He was home, or something close to it, and she was no longer just a name traced in ink or a hope whispered into folded paper. She was here, real, laughing in the sunlight, making soup in a house that still smelled faintly of lavender and candle wax. He hadn't returned to his parents' home. Instead, he'd taken up a small room above a bookshop in town. The owner, a widower named Mr. Fielding, had known James as a boy and offered it for next to nothing. The room overlooked a cobbled alley where chimney smoke mingled with falling leaves, and the clack of horse hooves on stone reminded James of a world not entirely swallowed by steel and shell. Every morning, he walked to Lillian's cottage by the river. His limp was no longer painful, but it remained a permanent rhythm in his stride. She said she liked it, said it made him look like someone who'd survived something big. "You did," she whispered once, fingers brushing the scar above his knee. "You came back. That's the biggest thing anyone can do." They spent days in quiet rituals, hanging laundry in the sharp morning air, reading side by side on the porch, picking apples from the tree behind the cottage, and baking pies that came out burned more often than not. Lillian painted watercolors, again delicate washes of gold and ash and storm blue, and James wrote in a journal, something the army doctor had encouraged. But sometimes he woke from dreams with the taste of mud in his mouth. Sometimes he flinched when the church bells rang. And sometimes when the wind hit just right, he saw smoke instead of mist rising off the hills. Lillian never pushed, never asked. She only wrapped a shawl around his shoulders and poured the tea a little slower, the way one might to anchor a fragile moment. In late October, Tom visited. He arrived with a crooked smile, a crutch, and a story about bartering chocolate for train fare. The reunion was quiet but warm. They sat on Lillian's porch, passing around a bottle of something sharp, and watched the light turn copper across the river. "Didn't think you'd make it," Tom said, nudging James. "Half the lads said you were done for." James only nodded. "So did I." Tom stayed for a week. He helped James with repairs on the shed, flirted shamelessly with the grocer's daughter, and smoked too much. On his last night, the three of them sat under a blanket of stars, and Tom pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Wrote this for someone," he said. "Didn't get to send it. Thought maybe you'd understand." James read the letter aloud. It was raw and strange and beautiful. A kind of poetry made of regret and gunpowder, and the things men done say until it is too late. Lillian cried. Tom looked away. Before he left, Tom pressed something into James's hand. A small tin locket. Inside was a photo-blurred, smiling old. A girl, a sister, a maybe. "Keep it," Tom said. "Reminds me that not everything was mud." November arrived with its hush. The trees dropped their leaves in one great, reluctant sigh. James found work helping Mr. Fielding organize books and restock shelves. He liked the order of it, the way titles lined up like soldiers, each one a world. Lillian, meanwhile, began teaching art to a handful of children in the village. Her laughter returned. So did her mischief. I told little Henry that the river has fish that sing opera at night, she confessed one evening. He swears he heard them. James grinned. He probably did. They were not married. Not yet, but everyone in the village assumed they would be. And maybe they would. But James was not in a hurry. He wanted to be sure he could give her all of himself, not just the parts that hadn't broken. One night, as they watched the fire crackle, Lillian reached for his hand. "Do you think," she asked softly, "you'll ever go back?" He didn't have to ask where. He shook his head. "Not if I can help it. But if they call again, I might have to." She nodded. "Then I'll write you every day." He looked at her. "Promise?" "With ink and soul," she said. December brought frost. The cottage roof glittered with morning ice, and James began chopping wood for both her and the neighbors. He carved her a small wooden box, lined it with velvet, and placed all her letters inside, every one folded in order, soft at the creases, alive with memory. On Christmas Eve, they exchanged gifts under the apple tree. She gave him a scarf she'd knitted in secret. It was too long, uneven, and perfect. He gave her a single sheet of paper, a letter. "From the day I thought I wouldn't make it," he said. She read it slowly, then twice, then held it to her chest. "This," she whispered, "is the most honest thing I've ever read." He kissed her then, properly, like punctuation at the end of a long, beautiful sentence. Winter settled in, but it didn't feel heavy. They survived on soup and the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. Every week, James mailed a letter to a different comrade's family, just to say they were remembered, just to say their names still lived in someone's voice. And Lillian began painting again, really painting. Not just soft fields and skies, but faces, scenes. A man with a cane and a daisy, a girl by the river, a train platform filled with ghosts. One afternoon, James found her sitting by the window, working on a new piece. It was them, older, walking through snow, still together. "You see the future?" he asked. She smiled. "I imagine it into being." He sat beside her, pulled her close. "Then paint us everywhere," he said. "Paint us into forever." And she did, with every stroke, every color, every page of their story, still unfolding, still warm, still here. The years that followed the war were unlike anything the world had known. Reconstruction meant more than buildings. It meant piecing back together the shattered bits of people's souls. For James and Lillian, it meant learning how to live in a world where silence no longer meant death, and every knock at the door wasn't a telegram bearing sorrow. They moved into a small stone cottage in the countryside of Surrey. It had been Lillian's aunt's once, a place overgrown with ivy and lavender. as if time had wrapped it gently in its arms and forgotten about it. James liked that. He liked forgetting a little. He liked remembering too, but only when he chose to. The cottage had an attic with a creaky wooden ladder. That's where Lillian kept the box of letters, all of them. His to her, hers to him, even the ones stained with dirt and blood. She never reread them aloud, not because they were too painful, but because they were sacred. Each Sunday they would sit in the garden where the foxgloves grew too wild and the robins returned without fail. James would lean back in his chair, cane propped beside him, and Lillian would bring out her sketchbook. She'd draw the same scene over and over. A bench by the river, a woman feeding birds, a man approaching with a limp and a daisy in his hand. It became a ritual, a promise painted over and over. But time, as it does, moved on. Years passed. The world changed its clothes 100 times. And though they aged together. James grew quiet, more than usual. His body ached with the kind of pain that couldn't be treated with medicine, the pain of carrying too many memories. He'd often wake at night, calling out names he hadn't spoken in years. Lillian never asked. She simply sat with him until the storm passed. They never had children, not for lack of want, but they never mourned what might have been. They had each other, and in quiet moments, that was enough. There was a winter longer than most when James didn't leave the house. His leg had stiffened beyond what even the cane could manage. He took to reading again, and writing. One day, Lillian found him at the kitchen table with stacks of new letters, unsigned. For who? She asked. The ones who never got to write back, he said. She didn't ask again. In the spring of 1951, James took ill. The doctors said it wasn't serious, but Lillian knew. There was a softness to him now, like an old coat worn thin. He spoke less. He held her hand longer. One evening, he asked her to bring him the box. They opened every letter. They read until the morning birds returned. Lillian cried only once, when she found the one he'd written the night before the offensive, the one he'd given Tom. You were my reason, he had written. She folded it and placed it back in its envelope. Still a.m., she whispered. James passed in his sleep on the first day of May. The garden was in bloom. The foxgloves bowed in the wind. The robins came and perched on the bench. Lillian dressed in blue. She sat in the garden for hours, waiting for the light to change. When the sun dipped low, she opened her sketchbook and drew the river. Then she added a man, walking with a cane, and a daisy in his hand. In the years that followed, she became a sort of legend in the village, the woman who sat by the river, always feeding birds, always with a sketchbook. Children would ask, "Who is she waiting for?" Their mothers would smile gently, someone who promised to find her. And every year, on the 1st of May, she would place a daisy on the bench beside her, just in case, because some promises are bigger than war, and some love stories don't end with goodbye. They end with silence, and begin again with memory. Lillian passed away quietly on an early autumn morning. Long after the war had faded from headlines and become the stuff of history books and documentaries, the world had changed again. Radios had become televisions. Letters had become phone calls, and phone calls were slowly becoming something else entirely. But in her little cottage, tucked away behind a hedge of lavender and wild rose, time had stood still. She was found by her neighbor, Mrs. Penelope Harris, who had brought her usual basket of black rat muffins and a thermos of tea. Lillian was seated in her favorite garden chair, her sketchbook resting on her lap, and the faintest trace of a smile on her lips. Her last drawing was a single daisy, detailed with such gentleness that one could almost smell it. The bench by the river was empty that day, but the daisy was already there. The news of her passing didn't make it past the village limits. There were no front-page obituaries, no state funerals, no distant cousins clawing for inheritance. Just a quiet will, a small set of keys, and a request that her belongings be donated to the local historical society if they wanted them. If not, then to the charity shop by the baker's lane. Mrs. Harris volunteered to help sort through the attic. She expected dusty blankets, forgotten Christmas ornaments, maybe some old paintings. What she found was the box. It was wrapped in linen, yellowed with time, tied with a ribbon so old it crumbled at the touch. A note rested on top, to be opened only when the past is ready to be remembered. She paused, holding the weight of it in her hands, then untied the ribbon. Inside were hundreds of letters, some in delicate cursive, some in rough, bold script, some with pages missing, some water-stained, some singed at the corners, but all of them addressed to the same two names, James Whitmore and Lillian Grace. Mrs. Harris wasn't a nosy woman. She believed in privacy and sacred things, but she also believed in stories. And as she read the first letter, trembling fingers brushing decades of silence off the page, she realized this wasn't just a box of correspondence. It was a monument, a cathedral of love, built one inked line at a time. She read for hours. She read the letters from James, shaky and blood-stained, written from trenches and aid stations. She read Lillian's replies, poetic and full of unspoken terror. She read about promises, about the daisy, about the river, about the bench. When she reached the final letter, the one James had written to the fallen, she cried, and then she did something unexpected. She called the local historian. The letters were archived, not locked away in vaults, but displayed, carefully, with white gloves and acid-free paper. The village museum created a small corner just for them. The Whitmore Grace letters, a love across the war, visitors came. At first, just locals, then tourists, then students, then journalists. And then one day, a man walked in with tears in his eyes. He didn't speak to anyone. He simply stood in front of the final letter, whispering the words, "You were my reason." He left a daisy on the glass. Years passed, but every May 1st, without fail, someone would leave a daisy on the bench by the river. Sometimes two, sometimes a small sketchbook. People whispered that Lillian and James had come back, that they walked the river paths at dawn. that robins followed them, singing songs only they could hear. The children in the village played near the garden gate, daring each other to knock and run, but the gate never opened. But the gate never opened, because it no longer needed to. The story had already let itself out, and it was walking through the world, letter by letter, daisy by daisy, love by love. There are moments in life that feel like they should have happened, but never did. Days that seem like they were promised in whispers and in dreams, but were stolen by time, war, or fear. For James and Lillian, one such day was always missing, their first day together, truly together, after the war. They had imagined it so many times. In letters passed through censers and shell fire, between dried bloodstains and rose petals, they painted it. A train platform, rain, a suitcase with a broken handle, the sound of footsteps. Then, finally, the silence of recognition. But that moment never came. So in the attic of imagination, and in the pages they never dared to write, that day remained suspended. Until now. Let us walk into it gently. Let us see what could have been, and feel what still lingers in the folds of time. It is May 1st, 1921. The war has been over for 3 years. The newspapers speak of treaties and elections, of shortages and strikes. But none of that matters in this moment. A train whistles in the distance. The village station, with its crooked sign and ivy-covered lamps, is quiet. A few locals mill about, speaking in low tones, waiting for mail or parcels or loved ones. Lillian stands near the edge of the platform. Her coat is buttoned all the way to the top, though the sun has started to warm the morning chill. Her fingers twist the strap of her bag again and again, like a nervous metronome. She is not young anymore. The war took her 20s. It took her sleep, but it did not take her hope. She holds a daisy, not because she expects anything, but because some promises deserve to be kept, even when the world forgets. The train arrives in a slow cloud of steam and groaning brakes. Doors open. People spill out, businessmen, widows, children with 2 large suitcases. Lillian scans the crowd. No one. She closes her eyes. Perhaps it was foolish. Perhaps she misread the date. Perhaps the letter she never received would have told her it was all a dream. But then a voice. Lillian? Soft, cautious, like a violin played for the first time in years. She turns. And there he is, James. Older, thinner. A cane in one hand, a scar across his left cheek. But his eyes are the same. She cannot move. He steps forward, slowly. The cane taps against the wooden boards of the platform. "You're real," she says, the words escaping like birds. "I didn't think I would be," he answers. There is a silence. Not the awkward kind, the sacred kind, the kind that holds everything. She lifts the daisy. "I thought maybe you'd need this." He laughs gently. "I do. More than anything." They walk through the village together, past the baker, who watches with curiosity, past the chapel, where bells have not rung in years, past the children who play with hoops and sticks, too young to know the meaning of scars. They do not speak much. Their hands brush once, then again. Then finally they interlace. They reach the river. The bench is there, untouched, waiting. James sits first, then Lillian. The daisy rests between them. Birds chirp. A wind stirs the leaves. I used to sit here, she says, when the world felt too heavy. I used to dream of it, he replies, in the mud, in the dark. And now? Now I think it was always waiting for us. They sit for hours. Time forgets them. There are no grand declarations, no fireworks, no sweeping music, only this. Two souls, found together, the first day they never had. Now, quietly unfolding, a story not written in history books, but felt deeply in the space between two heartbeats, and in the daisy still untouched. The attic had always been a quiet place, the kind of forgotten room that belonged more to dust than to memory. Yet on that pale September afternoon in 1921, Lillian pulled the chain to the creaking overhead bulb and stepped carefully into it. The wooden stairs groaned beneath her. It smelled of mothballs, cedar, and something faintly sweet like old paper left in a drawer too long. She had not been up here in years, not since the war, not since she had packed away the boxes labeled in her mother's handwriting, not since James. And now Jane sat downstairs in the drawing room, nursing a cup of weak tea and stronger silence. He had returned, but not all of him. There were pieces missing, words he used to say that no longer came, jokes left behind in the trenches, songs that never found their way back. His eyes still watched her with that quiet understanding, but there were shadows there, now deep ones, and old. Lillian wasn't looking for anything in particular, but memory has its own compass. She found the box beneath a sheet, behind a wicker chair with a broken leg. It was smaller than she remembered. Blue ribbon around the lid, yellowed corners. The word letters etched in fading ink on the side. Her heart stuttered. She lifted the lid. Inside were the letters she had written to him during the war. All of them, neatly tied, chronologically bundled. The first one, dated July 5th, 1915, began with trembling awkwardness. Dear soldier, I hope you don't mind me writing. Your letter came to me by accident, but I couldn't not reply. Lillian held the envelope to her chest. A dozen winters melted away. She sat on the floor, legs folded, dust motes floating around her like soft ghosts. She read the early letters, filled with questions and clumsy attempts at humor. She read the middle ones, where her words deepened and grew surer, as if writing to him had steadied her. And then the later ones, the ones written during the worst years. The letter she had sent after hearing about the sum. The one she wrote the day her father died. The one where she confessed shyly that she no longer thought of him as a stranger. Every letter was there, and on each one, faint pencil lines marked James's replies. Comments in the margins, doodles, underlines. It was not just her voice. It was a conversation, a record of their story, stitched in ink and longing. One letter caught her attention. It was different, not dated, folded separately, no envelope. She unfolded it with trembling hands. His handwriting, but not during the war. No, this was recent. Lillian, I don't know if I ever said it properly. Not in all those letters. Not even when I came back. But you saved me. Not just in spirit, in truth. There were nights in France when I held your letter in my hand and read the same sentence over and over, just to remind myself I was still human. I never deserved you. I never could. But you were there anyway. And if I seemed distant when I returned, it was only because I feared I wouldn't be enough. I still do, but I want to try. I want to be the man you saw in all those words. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for writing. Thank you for saving a broken boy who needed something beautiful to believe in. Yours, James. She pressed her lips to the page. Her breath caught. The attic spun slowly around her, but she felt anchored for the first time in years. Not because of the words alone, but because somewhere beneath all of it, beneath the war, beneath the silences, beneath the lost years and changed faces, he had kept her. Every word, every page. He had never thrown her away. That evening she brought the box down with her, placed it between them on the sitting room floor. James looked at it, then at her. You found them, he said. You kept them, she answered. A silence. Then James reached for the top bundle, held it in his scarred fingers like something sacred. Would you read one to me? He asked. She nodded, and so she read. They sat by the hearth. No fire, just the warmth of paper and the slow rekindling of memory. Letter by letter, night by night, they rewrote their story together. The wind had begun to change. It carried the scent of autumn through the trees, crisp with the promise of endings and beginnings. Leaves crackled underfoot along the garden path, and a quiet hush settled over the house at the edge of town, a hush not of absence, but of something finally complete. Lillian stood at the kitchen window, watching James as he sat on the old wooden bench beneath the oak tree. He wore his gray wool coat, the one she had stitched herself after the war, and though his hair had thinned and silvered over the years, his posture still carried that same thoughtful stillness. A man made of quiet resolve. It had been nearly a year since she'd found the box of letters in the attic, and since then everything had shifted, not dramatically, not suddenly, but like river stones worn smoother each day by the current of time. The silence between them had turned into space. The space had turned into comfort. And now something else was happening. Something inevitable. James was fading. Not in the way of sudden sickness or heartbreak. It was subtler than that. He had grown quieter again, and this time it wasn't the weight of war. It was the quiet of a man reaching the end of his story. She had known it in his slower steps, his long pauses in conversation, his growing fondness for watching the sunrise and listening to the birds instead of speaking. But he smiled more. And most nights, before sleep, he would ask just one letter, and she would read sometimes one of hers, sometimes one of his. They had read nearly all of them now, except one. It was a chilly evening when she found it, tucked not in the attic this time, but behind a book on the shelf in the study. A worn volume of Keats, its binding cracked and pages yellowed. It slipped out when she pulled the book down one last envelope, sealed in wax. Her name was written in the center, Lillian Rose Whitmore. The handwriting was recent. She turned it over in her hands. A note was tucked inside with a clipped corner. The paper was thick. James had written it carefully, deliberately. She could tell by the evenness of the lines, the way the ink had been pressed down hard, as if he wanted it to last. Dearest Lillian, if you're reading this, then I've likely taken my last walk beneath the oak, or I've fallen asleep during one of your lovely readings and simply failed to wake up. If so good, there's no better music to leave by. But don't let grief make a fool of you. I've had a life that most men only dream of. And I don't say that because of medals or survival or any notion of soldierly pride. I say it because of you. You gave me more than a second chance. You gave me a self. I don't know how else to put it. A person is a scattered thing, Lillian. Fragments of childhood, choices, regrets. The war scattered me into pieces too small to see, and yet your letters gathered them. Somehow with every word you rebuilt me, even when I was a stranger, even when I returned broken and afraid. You held the map of who I had been and who I could be. This is not a goodbye letter. It's a thank you. Thank you for believing in a ghost and pulling him back into the light. Thank you for never expecting me to be whole, but helping me feel like I was anyway. Thank you for the silence, the tea, the walks, the smiles, the letters, the arguments, the forgiveness. Thank you for not letting my absence harden you or your waiting weaken you. You are the bravest person I've ever known. Not for enduring war, but for loving someone who had. And if love outlives memory, if someday I no longer remember your name or the sound of your voice, I want you to know, somewhere inside me in the part no sickness can touch, I will still be yours. With everything, James Lillian sat in the study for a long time. The fire crackled softly beside her. Outside, the wind stirred the last of the maple leaves from the branches. She did not cry, not immediately. Instead, she laughed. It bubbled up unexpectedly, like joy remembered, like a story with a final chapter that didn't feel like an end. She imagined him hiding the letter behind the Keats book, his face serious, his hands trembling with the effort of writing so neatly. Even now, he was thinking of her comfort before his fear. It was so James. She folded the letter and placed it in the old box with the others. Then she walked to the garden. James was still there, eyes closed, breathing slow. She sat beside him. He opened his eyes barely. "Did you find it?" he asked. She nodded. He smiled. "That was the last one," he whispered. "No more secrets now." She reached for his hand. "Then let's not waste any more time," she said softly. And so they sat, two souls, stitched by words, aged by years, bound by the invisible thread of ink and intention. They watched the horizon together, no war between them, no silence left unspoken, just the final peace of knowing that the story they had built, by accident, by fate, by choice, was whole, and that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with a letter never meant to be read.